Later on today, the Prime Minister will make a statement in the House of Commons on the UK's response to Europe's growing refugee crisis. He's expected to announce a major shift in government policy and set out plans to resettle thousands of refugees fleeing the civil war and Islamic State in Syria. Ellie takes a look back at a summer which saw the continent's biggest refugee crisis since World War II.
David Cameron's pledge to take in thousands more Syrian refugees came at the end of a summer of crisis.
Britain will act with our head and our heart, providing refuge for those in need while working on long-term solutions to this crisis.
The coverage at least seemed to start in Calais. As they had for months, night after night, hundreds of migrants tried their luck boarding lorries bound for the UK, by ferry or by the Channel Tunnel. The UN says the majority of those in the so-called jungle there are refugees, many from Syria, Eritrea and Sudan. But following yet more deaths, the focus was soon back on those migrants crossing into Europe across the Mediterranean. According to the International Organization for Migration, more than 2,600 have drowned trying. Then just over a week ago, 71 bodies were found in the back of a lorry in Austria. They were some of the thousands of migrants now travelling through Hungary en route to Germany. Throughout the summer, David Cameron's language has been tough.
This is very testing, I accept that, because you've got a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean, seeking a better life, wanting to come to Britain.
And the government insisted it was responding. In Calais, with cooperation from the French, security was tightened, more police and a much bigger fence was built. In the Med, a Royal Navy presence in the form of HMS Bulwark and later HMS Enterprise, said to have rescued more than 6,500 people. And then, as Germany announced plans to take in 800,000 Syrian refugees this year, David Cameron insisted taking more and more refugees wasn't the answer, and pointed out that Britain is the second largest bilateral aid donor to Syria. But the pressure at home and in Europe mounted.
Yes, I am angry, very angry at the walk-on by on the other side approach of the UK government.
Britain needs to act. At the moment, it's just the government that is saying no. Those who are refugees from war should be fairly divided according to the size and economic power of each EU country.
And then there was one image, one death, that appeared to be a turning point. The next day, the PM announced Britain would take Syrian refugees, but not those already in Europe. And despite some criticism, he has a delicate balancing act to stay in line with public opinion.
Two-thirds of people simultaneously saying that we should do all we can to protect genuine asylum seekers, and two-thirds of people in the same survey saying we should not take in asylum seekers.
Throughout the summer, the government said its response must deal with the crisis in Syria at source. Yesterday, George Osborne confirmed that could include airstrikes if Parliament agreed.
Personally, I think the Prime Minister thinks, the Defence Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, we all think there is a strong case and indeed an argument around coherence that if you're tackling ISIS on one side of the Iraqi border, you should be tackling it on the other side in Syria.
More than 350,000 migrants have passed into Europe since January this year, but Britain will only take refugees in camps like these on the Syrian border. And quite how many, we'll find out later today.
And with us now is the Daily Mail columnist Peter Hitchens. Welcome to the Daily Politics.
Sunday.
Slip of the tongue. Slip of the tongue, it is indeed. I apologise. First of all, to you, Andrew Mitchell. When the Prime Minister speaks in the Commons later on, he's likely to put a number on the amount of Syrian refugees that the UK will take in. Is it right to accept more?
Well, I mean, it's good that Britain is supporting the humanitarian effort overwhelmingly in the camps around Syria. But at the end of the day, we have to address the causes of all of this, and not just the symptoms. And that's why today I have called for the international community to mount an intense diplomatic effort to bring in humanitarian areas of safe passage where people can live in safety.
Right, well, we'll come on to the details of the safe havens, but the question I asked is the government right to take in more Syrian refugees?
Well, it sets the right tone. It responds to a feeling in Britain that we should do more, and frankly the number of refugees that Britain is going to take, given the scale of movement out of Syria, is very small. But
do you know what the number is then?
Well, there's something like 9 million people on the move. In the camps around Syria, there are hundreds of thousands of people. There's 1.2 million people in Lebanon, a country of 4 million. The equivalent of that in Britain would be 18 million people. So
it's a drop in the ocean, in your view?
Taking in a few refugees will help the refugees we take in. But any idea either that Britain has not fulfilled its proper humanitarian role, which it has done in respect of the £1 billion we've spent supporting hundreds of thousands of people in Syria and the camps and countries around, is totally wrong.
So has the government, has the government then overreacted, in your view, to that picture, that single picture that seemed to encapsulate the tragedy of this Syrian refugee and migrant crisis?
Well, the picture is extremely upsetting, but I have to tell you that over the last 3 years, pictures like that would have been available every day on the side of the Mediterranean, every week of those 3 years. So, I mean, the picture has galvanised public attention to this.
But it's galvanised the government too, hasn't it?
Well, it's galvanised public attention, and my point is that the public need to pressurise governments to take serious diplomatic efforts to address the causes of all of this.
All right, we'll come to Tristram. How many refugees do you think the UK should take in, Syrian refugees?
Well, Yvette Cooper called for 10,000. We'll hear this afternoon whether it's going to be 15,000 or so. But I think
do you think that's the right figure, though? Well,
let's start with that. Let's see whether we can, manage that appropriately. Where we also find the refugees from and those fleeing persecution going to the camps, I think that's not a bad strategy. But as Andrew said, there are 9 million people on the move. Dealing with this at cause is absolutely vital. But we do,
but that's
as a
long
country,
term. That is a long-term strategy, isn't it? We've got a crisis that's going on right now here with Syrian refugees within EU borders. And I take your point, as do most people, about dealing with the causes, and we'll come on to how you deal with Syria and the situation. But in terms of the crisis that is here and now, was it right for David Cameron to say only to take refugees from the camps in Jordan and Lebanon?
What I think was not right was, as it were, just to react to this now. What would have been better, because we know this has been building up all over summer, to have a sustained strategy for it. I do think there is an issue about making sure that this isn't a situation which invites more and more people to pay more and more money to people traffickers, and you have the criminal component of it. So whether, and we'll hear from the Prime Minister this afternoon, whether this will actually be humanitarian intervention to make sure that those fleeing persecution are looked after, whilst also making sure that we don't give succour to those who want to engage in people trafficking.
Yeah, I'm going to come to potential just 1 minute. But isn't it true? I mean, the logic of this is the government could have taken more refugees from the camps in Jordan and Lebanon at any point over the last 4 years. They've been at breaking point. We've had reports endlessly from a country like Lebanon that only has a population, I think, of around 4 million. It has about 1.5 to 2 million Syrian refugees. So, half of its population again. So I would say to you that the only reason the government is going to offer to take another 10, 15,000 refugees was that picture, and because it misjudged the public mood, rightly or wrongly. Isn't that true?
Well, we've taken something like 5,000 people from Syria
over the last 5 years.
Over the last 4 years.
But
it's a positive humanitarian response to take some small number of refugees. But the point is that these Syrian people are, on the whole, not wanting to start a new life in a new continent. They want to go back to the places from which they fled, and they want the fighting to stop. And keeping them close to where they lived is a much better response in the end than taking them to another continent.
Has the government only responded as a result of this image of this 3-year-old boy drowned on the beach, or has it had a well-thought-out strategy to deal with this?
It's plainly responded because of the picture. Huge numbers of people have joined in trying to establish that they care more about the picture than anybody else, which is up to them if they want to establish it. But obviously that's the case. I think what we're really missing here is the point of terminology. Someone's a refugee when he's trying to leave somewhere to get away from it. Once he's got away from it and got away from the peril or the threat that he or she faces, then he isn't a refugee anymore. What we would take if we took people here would be migrants. And the pressure which is on, and there is a very strong pressure from the European Union, the OECD believes there should be millions more migrants coming into Europe, is for all the countries of the European Union to take in very much larger numbers of migrants from North Africa, from the Middle East and from the Muslim parts of the world, which would transform the whole of Europe and would transform this country if we agree to it. I think there are some people opportunistically taking advantage of the tragedy of the boy to try and press this agenda and to make us stop thinking about it. If you stop thinking about it, then you will invariably get it wrong.
Has emotion clouded judgment, political judgment on how to deal with this issue?
Well, completely, but it's clouded political judgment since the beginning, since we and other countries took part in the disastrous destabilisation of Syria, which led to the civil war, which led to this, since we and other countries took part in the disastrous destruction of the stability of Libya. These things have actually been made immensely worse by our own thoughtless, emotive stupidity.
And what do you say to that, Andrew?
Well, let's not go back into.
Why not? If we don't
you said you want to deal with the causes.
If we don't grasp that we made terrible mistakes, we'll make them again. And we made the Iraq mistake, which again, huge numbers of people in our establishment still won't admit. We made the Libya mistake. We made the Syria mistake. And George Osborne, for judging from his interview yesterday, has learned absolutely nothing from this at all. He still thinks Parliament should have voted for bombing Assad. What is it, 2 years ago?
Yes, well, let's put that to Tristram Hunt.
Unbelievable.
Because Peter Hitchens mentions George Osborne's comment that it was the worst decision the Commons ever made. And we need to distinguish that the decision that was made then, primarily by Labour at the time, led by Ed Miliband, was not to support a motion to debate military action in Syria against Bashar al-Assad. Do you regret that now?
No, I think that was the right decision at the time. I think where Peter is correct is the complexity of it. Today we're hearing about quite sustained Russian build-up in support of Assad in Syria. This is a very, very difficult military situation.
So would you support airstrikes
which doesn't have clear, outcomes one way or the other. We are open to a government motion about airstrikes if there is
against
if there is a proper strategy behind it. But there are no easy answers to this. This is a really
Labour is open to this now.
Yes.
Right.
This is a really complicated civil war situation which also, is not delineated by traditional boundaries between Syria and Iraq. The whole point of the IS strategy is to go
If we now
beyond that.
intervene in Syria, we will be intervening on the opposite side to the one we're proposing to intervene
Yeah, it would be a different.
It's the most amazing thing, and no one ever says this. We were actually planning to intervene on the side of the people who turned into ISIS. That's what we were planning to do.
Well,
we were going to bomb Syria.
We
were going to provide the RAF as an air force for the people who turned into ISIS.
I don't know whether
it was insanity.
Hang on.
I don't know whether.
We're very lucky we didn't do it.
I don't know whether it was the worst decision Parliament made, but I do think that I do think that it was absolutely right to have taken military action then, because it was very specifically against the command and control assets which looked after the chemical weapons in Syria. So I voted for it, and I believe that Parliament got it wrong in not supporting it. But we are where we are today, and when it comes to a decision on whether or not we should extend the air support that we're giving to the coalition forces over Syria, we need to remember that the Iraq-Syria border is illusory. The ISIL don't.
Well, they don't recognise that border.
But
let me just
let me just make this point that in the end, if we're going to do this, it needs to be part of a bigger strategy. Just bombing people is not sensible. We need to be part of a bigger strategy, and we need the entire international community engaged in a diplomatic.
But that's unlikely. Can I just come back to Peter, because Peter, you've criticised the government and you've talked about the emotion that has clouded judgment. What would you do now in terms of, from a humanitarian perspective? Would you take any Syrian refugees, any more than the 216 that have been taken? Would you get involved at all in the quota system that the European Commission would like to see Britain part of as an EU country, to try and relieve the pressure on countries like Macedonia or Italy, Greece and Hungary?
No, I don't think it's any part of our responsibility. What we should be doing...
Really, from a humanitarian point of view?
The UNHCR is appealing at the moment. It says it has no money left to cope with the refugees, which it's looking after in Jordan and in Lebanon, and it very badly needs that. That is the kind of support we can give. It keeps people secure in places where they need to be and want to be, so they can return to their country when it recovers to stability, which we robbed it of. So I think that's the justest and most effective thing we can do, and it's also nothing to do with making us feel good. It's to do with doing good. We should always separate the two things.
We have fully funded the
so much of foreign policy at the moment is based on making us ourselves
Well,
feel
let me
good
just say, do
rather
you
than
think George
doing
Osborne is obviously going to raid the international development budget,
No,
isn't he?
that is
well, he said very clearly yesterday
be-
that he is going to use money from the
Yes.
international development budget
Yes.
to help with housing and supporting refugees here. That's not what international aid is for.
With greatest respect, that is completely wrong.
Well, which bit is wrong?
I will explain. The international development budget is governed by the rules set out by the OECD DAC. These are the rules under which the 0.7 is spent, and they include supporting refugees that come to Britain in their first year here. So there is nothing outside of the rules which we are committed to on the spending of the 0.7 involved in supporting the refugees who come here now.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Pete Hitchens. Now, later today, MP